Kai Lewis is going to be talking to us today about culturally responsive teaching. And so she's got a great agenda here about creating a welcoming environment in your classroom. I know environment was always one of my sort of favorite things to think about and experiment with whenever I was in the classroom. So I'm so curious to see what she has to say about that. Definitely going into some instructional things, some curriculum, and also inclusive assessments. I think those are going to be really fascinating as well. Probably going to be some things that we haven't thought about before that you can take into your classroom. And then some ongoing professional learning and support. So some resources there. At the end, in the last few minutes, I will pop into the chat and give you a link to number one, a handout from Dr. Kai Lewis. And then I will also give you a link to our survey. It's very quick. And the main reason we would like to get it from you is to find out what other topics of webinars you would like to see how this particular webinar content worked for you. And we want to be sure to get your email address and name because we will send you your certificate of completion at the end of this workshop. And that way you can turn that into your school district to get 1 credit hour. So, Dr. Kai Lewis, if you wouldn't mind joining us on camera. We actually know Dr. Kai Lewis here at Music Workshop because she has been an advisor for multiple courses of ours, including our most recent hip hop course that came out last fall. That was so much fun to work on with her. And so I just want to welcome you, Dr. Kai Lewis, and tell us a little bit more about you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I am Dr. Abimbola Cole Kai Lewis. I am an ethnomusicologist, so I study music in its cultural context. I was smiling off camera when I saw that some of you are working in collegiate spaces because we have the expansiveness of the K to 16, as we're calling it here in the States now. Thinking about those who are at the State College of Pennsylvania, I am now an asynchronous professor at Temple University, but I also teach in person at Hofstra University and York College, City University of New York. And the other institution that I work at is Berklee College of Music, and I'm part of their online program in the Africana Studies Department. So I'm going to be drawing on the breadth or the scope of those experiences in the K to 16 space to share some ideas with you. And as has been presented, please don't hesitate to use the chat. Any questions that pop up, I can't promise that I will see them, but we will have these benchmarks and pause periodically. And that thumbs up is letting me know that we are good to go. So what I'm going to do is begin sharing my presentation, and we will begin thinking collectively about culturally responsive teaching. So let's see, I'm going to go ahead. I think we're good. Yep. Then I'm just going to put it into slideshow mode so we could get started. Oh, apologies. One more time, I will open it and enlarge it, and then we will rejoin that way. So here's second time, sharing screen, full screen, and now we're good to go. So once again, I'm Dr. Abimbola Cole Kai Lewis, and we will be thinking about this space of culturally responsive teaching. I want to ensure that we take a moment to go through our agenda. So as we think about culturally responsive, sustaining education, I'm going to be tapping into the framework that has been shared here in New York State. Although it was something that was prepared under a directive in 2018, and it was something that I actively used as a classroom teacher, as a special education teacher for students in middle school spaces, specifically 6 to 8, grade 6 to 8. I will use it as something that can be used to think about culturally responsive teaching and this culturally responsive sustaining education as I've also transitioned into the collegiate space. So I will introduce that culturally responsive sustaining education framework that we often refer to as CRSE. Then I'll think about those four core components that also appeared in our agenda that we saw a few moments ago. And that pertains to creating a welcoming and affirming environment, which I hope we've also done here as you all have come into this virtual space and that we have this virtual conversation together. Secondly, fostering high expectations and rigorous instruction. I will have a series of slides of photographs that are related to projects that I've done. Some of them I'll just have to refer to because I had pictures with students and I didn't want to share those pictures with the students' faces, but there are moments that we can talk about. And the third part of the framework is identifying inclusive curriculum and assessment. And we'll talk about that as well based on the framework and some of the suggested areas. And then lastly, engaging in ongoing professional learning and support. I think I'll be transparent. I touch upon that least because I feel like many of you have already embraced this aspect. So I will give you the bullets to highlight that, but we are already engaging in that together. There will also be references, and those are going to be the core collection of references that I refer to throughout the webinar. And that will all be available to you on the handout. It's just two sides, the double-sided sheet, and you can refer to that as needed. So if you're a note taker, I know I already have my notebook in front of me. If you're a note taker, please feel free to take notes, but the information that's shared out will be distributed with you. The only thing that will not be included is the photographs that are enhancing my presentation. So with this idea of culturally responsive, sustaining education in the framework, what I wanted to do is just take a moment to show you some of the images from travels to the Metropolitan Museum. I say travels as if it was a lengthy trip, but when I was teaching at a middle school in Brooklyn, my students and I frequently went to the Metropolitan Museum to reinforce this. And this is in Astor Court. So you're looking at a series of images of the artwork that was there, as well as some of the installations. But in terms of thinking about our introduction, the New York State Education Department, commonly referred to as NYSED, published the Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. It is based on a 2018 research directive. And in thinking about this directive, one of the goals was to think about how we could continue expanding upon our teaching practices, and as we often refer to it as our toolkit, so the things that we're bringing into the classroom to enhance our teaching. So this framework, the CRSE framework, was central to my work as a middle school special education classroom teacher. And while I shared that my students and I went on trips, I was tasked with teaching a series of things in a 12 to 1-to-1 classroom. If you're unfamiliar with that, that's 12 students who are neurodivergent and neurodiverse, and then one core teacher and one paraprofessional. I was responsible for teaching primarily English language arts and social studies. Then, as the city mobilized for phonics, that was something that was incorporated. At different periods, I've also taught science and math. But in thinking about this, I felt that English language arts and social studies were perfectly suited for applying CRSE. And I'll talk more about that briefly. But districts promoted the expansion of school-wide CRSE initiatives and programming. So that entailed the curricula that were being rolled out within schools. There were also study groups, or inquiry groups, I think is more accurate for what the title would be, to think about ways to enhance this. And there are also programs that were developed across districts to find ways to get teachers into action research initiatives, to continually think about ways of refining teaching practices to make their practices more culturally relevant. So in my former district, this led to the formulation of the Equity Fellows Program for district-wide administrators, staff, and teachers. And it was in the Equity Fellows Program that I really started to think about the ways in which the arts, so not limiting it to simply music, but thinking about music and the arts, like the artworks that are in collections, such as locations like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, could be used to enhance engagement. So thinking about how this arts-based education programming could really help students thrive and stretch their experiences in the classroom and beyond. My action research explored how the incorporation of arts programming can be used to enhance student engagement. And one of the things that I think is also key, thinking about this work that evolved during the pandemic. I was speaking with Sarah before the webinar started about the ways in which we navigated Zoom and teaching throughout the pandemic, thinking about this period between 2020 and 2021, even rolling into 2022, and thinking about ways to bring learning alive and ignite students' learning in new ways. So, my work drew upon research conducted as a member of the Apollo's Education Advisory Committee and the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Professional Learning Community, commonly referred to as the PLC. And I was part of the Apollo's Education Advisory Committee for a 3-year period between 2019 to 2022. And it started to taper off after I transitioned out of the K to 12 space and worked and started work in collegiate spaces. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art's PLC was something that I had the opportunity to apply and participate in during the pandemic. So, thinking about bridging that year 2020 to 2021, I was tasked with working alongside a teaching artist who led a number of virtual explorations of artists such as Jacob Lawrence. I was also tasked with designing virtual museum tours, so finding artworks in the actual collection at the Met, and sometimes tapping into the Met's education department to see if they could send me digital images that I was able to use over the course of that period to really think about ways in which we could make our learning more engaging. So today's webinar will highlight aspects of CRSE, culturally responsive and sustaining education, in my time teaching in New York City public schools. I will use the 4-part CRSE model to structure our work together today, and supplemental details and images will be featured from moments attending events at the Apollo and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, such as those 3 initial images from Astor Court. So, based on some of the details appearing in this introduction, what are some preliminary questions that you may have about culturally responsive teaching? Yes, I have the slides and the images, and yes, we can delve into this work, and I can share a series of examples. But I'm wondering if you all could drop that into the chat. What are some of the questions that you have related to culturally responsive teaching? Or if you're unfamiliar with this notion of CRSE, culturally responsive, sustaining education, what are some questions you may have related to that? I saw that something popped up. So what I
Yeah, I'll actually just read them out loud in case not everyone's looking at the chat. So we've got one
thank you.
from Janet, and that's, what if I make a mistake and make my student feel uncomfortable?
I think it's a thoughtful question, Janet. Thank you for that. One of the things that I frequently did in my own practice was bringing students into the conversation as we were designing curricula, as we were mapping out trips. So there was a constant barometer, there was a constant assessment of whether they felt uncomfortable. And my students and I had the rapport in such a way that they would actively share when something did feel uncomfortable, not waiting until the moment had passed or having the awkward, difficult, uncomfortable moments, but also leaning into that. I would say if we all make mistakes, none of us are infallible. So in the moments, if there is a mistake, really finding ways to pivot and to um, find a different entry point for the culturally responsive teaching. And one of the things I could say to really give a concrete example for that, at the former middle school that I was teaching at, my last teaching assignment prior to the collegiate space, we were an international baccalaureate school, which meant that as the one of the main classroom teachers, because I was tasked with primarily English language arts and social studies or humanities, I was crafting these units. But to think about how to make it culturally responsive and sustaining, thinking about those components, I would talk to the students in brainstorm sessions and ask them what they wanted to do, what they were thinking about. And it took us down the path, everything from explorations of the way that cultural sentiments about swimming have impacted African Americans and other diverse communities throughout the United States, and thinking about the history of that, but also thinking about how in our English language arts class, we were also able to explore the ways in which um, Islam and being a Muslim American student and having that experience was also something that could enrich our classroom experience, because I did have a student whose family was from Yemen, even though he was born here in Brooklyn, and he had a great deal of cultural pride. So, and we have some images we'll encounter shortly, but when we were able to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and go to the Islamic art wing, he was able to make all of these connections. So instead of being preoccupied or anxious about the mistakes, it was leaning into the conversations and lifting up those points from students to see where the dialogue and conversations would take us. And also having very clear expectations about what each of us was bringing to that conversation. And we'll talk about expectations as well. So I really hope that I've answered your question. But I also saw that another question flashed into the chat. So I don't know if
Yeah, for
is a
sure.
follow-up.
And I was gonna say, Dr. Kai Lewis, it just sounds like you're coming from this place of student-centered learning, or students being able to take ownership of their own learning and just really being there for that. So I'm
Yeah.
kind of curious actually to our attendees out there, what sorts of student-centered learning are you doing in your classrooms? Can you do more? How does it feel to
Mm,
do that? Another question from Veronica is,
yes.
and it's funny, Dr. Kai Lewis and I were talking about this in the green room right before we came in. She says, will teachers be fearful to implement
Mm,
it when there are
mm,
DEI and CRT pushbacks around the country?
mm. And I think that it's a time of sensitivity. It's a time of being alert and aware of how we teach and what we teach. And to be perfectly honest, that's also something that I know colleagues on the collegiate level have been concerned about and have expressed and been very vocal about that. One thing that I will say in terms of thinking about approaches to teaching, I'm a member of a number of different professional societies and organizations. And just last month, I was able to share a presentation, but also sit and share space with members of the American Historical Association, the AHA. And the guidance that they were saying is really to um, find out the best ways to approach learning within your unique classroom learning environment, within your school district, within the um, the governance or the direction of your school superintendent. Because for me, recognizing in New York, I'm in a very diverse space. New York, and as I'm speaking to you, I'm someone who's Sierra Leonean American, and then there's all of these other cultural strands, and also very much American. So thinking about the space of DEI and thinking about all the things that we're hearing in the news, I would say just finding out what the landscape is where you are specifically, and moving confidently in that space, but also moving within the space that is established within your school community. And I know that's going to vary. And I know that there's also a range of different backgrounds and experiences, as people have shared. They're coming in from Australia. There are other people who are on the West Coast. There are people who are all um, spread across North America, the United States, and around the world. So I think that the circumstances will be very different. If I'm thinking about the diversity and the experiences in Australia, that will be one story. If I'm thinking about diversity here in New York, that's yet another. And I saw there were also people from Massachusetts. So thinking about how each unique um, enclave, community, school, I would say even down to classroom, is built and suited for that work. I would say don't feel defeated, but find the strategies that work best in your unique circumstances. And I hope that's helpful. And I hope that you're able to teach in such a way that you can be responsive that to the cultures of the students that are before you, as well as to reflect the broader cultures that are represented in your respective school communities as a whole. I don't know, were there any other questions? I want to be mindful because I know sometimes I tend to teach like we have 3 hours, and
I
I
wish
know we just
I wish
have
we
30
did.
minutes. I
I wish we
know
did have that much time with you. Let's just continue with your presentation and then
we'll do.
we
We'll do.
will take some questions as we go along if things come
Sounds
up,
good.
or we can
And
save.
we'll see where we land. We'll see how the questions evolve. And please continue to actively use the chat, even though I will continue on. We could revisit the comments. So thinking about this space of a welcoming environment, I just have these three pictures of the classroom. The last middle school classroom that I worked in, there was a constant discussion of thinking about the ways that we could use images of the students. So I have images in the upper right-hand corner of our trip to the Met, and the students would be actively engaged in selecting the borders that we picked and the fans. Like I would purchase some of these items, but the students had an active hand in it. So it was an exciting moment when the materials would arrive and we put them up because it was a collective labor. The word wall that you see here is based on a community artworks unit that started to become a through line for the work we did at the Met. But I have up imagery of an amazing artist, ceramicist, and potter. He calls himself the village potter, Roberto Lugo, who actually has some things that are on sale at Walmart now. Not to plug Walmart, but to say that he's expanded. But he was somebody whose work was also, as we'll see briefly, included in the collection at the Met in the Afrofuturist period room, and we'll think about that. But his imagery was up as part of the word wall. So for students that had different entry points with their literacy, they had both the image and the actual words that were printed on the sheets that were put up. And this was rotating. It's not that these core images stayed up, but that was for that particular unit. And the picture on the bottom is just the picture beneath, the picture behind the desk that I used to have. So putting up images that are related to artworks that my friends created. I had up a pennant banner for my sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And I also had up a project that I did with the students as an exemplar, as a constant reminder of the work we were doing together. But when we get back into the framework, a few strategies used to create a welcoming environment are classroom welcoming rituals. We'll talk briefly about that. I am a strong believer, even though I was silent as you all entered this space and we were listening to Take Five. I think that it's interesting to think about the space of radical welcoming and radical hospitality. And we'll talk about that because I've been seeking to practice that since I first learned about it in 2021 through Lincoln Center. So we'll think about that. Another strategy that we used in my classroom space was practicing daily meditation and yoga. I have a Peloton account, and I am not one of the hardware Peloton users. I'm not on the tread, I'm not on the bike, but I do frequently use their yoga and their Yoga Anywhere series. So students, we would practice implementing 5 or sometimes 10-minute yoga practices throughout the day. Oftentimes we think of it as brain breaks, but finding ways to incorporate um, that into our flow of the day. It was a great way to start the day with meditation. When students come in, sometimes they'd be flustered. They'd have a breakfast sandwich in one hand and orange juice in a backpack, and they would be hot after coming up 4 flights of stairs. So that cool down time was useful. I shared earlier, another strategy is including photographs to the classroom space, then playing chill hop playlists. I stumbled upon Chill Hop with the little raccoon and the characters in the pandemic. And it was something that was incorporated into online school-wide social emotional learning efforts and online gatherings. But that playlist, it got us through frustrating times. It also got us through times when we needed background music for work. And then lastly, I had lunchtime chat sessions, and it wasn't always dedicated to chatting. Sometimes it could just be a student says, you know what, Dr. Kailis, I want to watch Zootopia today. can I come up and do that during lunchtime? And my Disney Plus account was very beneficial for such moments because we would have Zootopia on the whiteboard, and the students would feel comfortable, and it created more of um, a welcoming environment beyond just instructional space. So those were some of the strategies that were used. And as we think about these classroom welcoming practices, and this will all appear in the handout, thinking about the work of Dr. Christopher Emdin and Gholdy Muhammad, they promote the concept of radical welcoming in classrooms. And thinking specifically about Dr. Emdin, he shared examples of radical welcoming at Lincoln Center's 2021 Activate Professional Learning Series. And it was really beautiful. There are still some aspects of that workshop online through YouTube, but as he presented it, this entailed making the classroom accessible for multiple kinds of learning and learners. He had the opportunity to design um, a dream classroom, if you would call it that. And as we all tuned in virtually, some people were on site, but for those of us who joined virtually, we could see it. And it really left an impact that resonated with me. Because when I think of radical welcoming, when people enter a virtual space, when I teach virtually, or if they enter a physical space, I automatically say welcome back after our initial session. So I say welcome during the first session and welcome back after they've come back for multiple iterations of the course. The other thing that's also important, and I'm sure, students, when they hear me chirping this, sometimes I think that they just feel like it's part of a shtick or a spiel, but I genuinely want to welcome them back. And thinking about this in terms of Dr. Muhammad, she described radical welcoming in an Equity Fellows professional learning program, so the district program I described. And she indicated that this relates to welcoming all students, no matter when they enter our classrooms. So if a student is running late and they're coming to class, are we still making them feel welcome? That was what she posed to us. Or are we just sort of acting like they came in, okay, get settled? And thinking about how welcoming is in our affect and how we express it verbally in our body language. These are some of the things that stuck with me throughout these sessions, but they helped me to continue thinking about welcoming to the point that some of my collegiate students, if I'm doing something with a notebook or getting my textbook out and they come in and I don't say it, I remember very distinctly one student say, "Hey, professor, you didn't say welcome back today. What's going on?" So thinking about how that builds broader routines. But this concept of radical welcoming is also recognized in my collegiate teaching. And most recently, radical welcoming is converted into this notion of, quote, radical hospitality, end quote, which was also a cousin idea or a parallel term to what Dr. Emdin shared. But this has been apparent in my work with Berklee College of Music. And the dean of our Africana Studies department, Dean Emmett Price, has introduced this as part of the overall work conducted in our department. So, radical hospitality is captured in communal commitment and the establishment of positive relationships. So, thinking about it as this ongoing space. How are we welcoming people? How are we helping to make them feel a part? So, these are some of the things in terms of thinking about the welcome practices. And just to think about time, I have a little bit of time. I want to dig in a little bit deeply, but please use the chat to think about this and establishing any questions or comments. What might radical hospitality or, excuse me, not of, or radical hospitality or welcoming look like in your classroom communities? So what shape can that take? What can you say? What can you do? What does that look like? And also thinking very intentionally about how does that feel? How would it feel for you as a facilitator or the educator introducing it? But how do you think it would feel for your students? So we will go on just so we can get to a few more core things because apologies for my toolbar. A few things because I have until at latest 7:45, which gives us 10 minutes. I don't want to rush, but I do want to give you just a few slides that can guide our discussion where we can have a more free-flowing discussion, but please keep all your questions and comments coming in the chat. So the next thing that we'll talk about is this notion of high expectations and rigorous instruction appearing in the framework. So a few of the strategies used to foster high expectations and rigorous instruction are construct a collaborative set of class expectations. So I used to do this, I would have them posted on the wall like it was a constant reminder. So thinking about which sets of expectations would be beneficial for your classroom community, as we were speaking earlier about how we make things relevant in the spaces in which we are teaching, working, existing. That's one way to think about these class expectations, setting the tone. Secondly, integrating students' cultural identities into instruction. And that's something that I frequently did. I did not know much about Yemen. I did not know much about um, the migration of students from countries because we read about Syrian migration, thinking about what that looks like in classroom communities. But students, we started to explore it through the literature we read, through the narratives that we encountered, and through artworks, as I mentioned, getting into the engagement. The third strategy is drawing upon artists and community members for lessons. That was something I was really fortunate, I would say blessed to have friends and family members who were willing to come in and speak with my students. When we did a college unit, college and career readiness unit, I had friends come in from the University of South Carolina. They Zoomed in with us. I had a friend who's an administrator in New York City Public Schools who shared her experiences, and also as the president of the Spelman Alumni Association, the college that I went to and that we went to, she spoke about that. And the students really got excited, and it showed them another dimension of what the academic space could be beyond the K to 12, beyond the 6 to 8 environment we were in. And I think another powerful moment was when my nephew, who is a college student and is approaching the end of his college, his undergraduate experience, came in, and he's in the marching band. So he played for the students and they really loved it. And it was a beneficial experience for them to connect with someone who is closer to their age, but could also speak real time about their experience. So a few more strategies are using elements of students' personal experiences within communities, even as students travel back to home countries. There were students who would share about the vacations and come in and bring pictures and share excitedly about what had happened when they were able to visit relatives in other locations. And the last strategy, which will dovetail with what we're about to look at, is implementing project-based learning. So one of the ways that we brought the arts and project-based learning into the classroom was thinking about uh, tying in local arts institutions. And the Brooklyn Academy of Music was, I would say, we walked very slowly. So it was about a 15-minute walk from the school where I taught. But it's a local New York institution, but it's a hub for the arts in Brooklyn and one of the five boroughs. So thinking about Dance Africa 2023, it was a celebration of Ghanaian music and culture. And Baba Abdel Salam was at the forefront, following Baba Chuck Davis. But thinking about the performance, this was what the stage looked like, and I was able to take the students. We had a teaching artist who came to visit our school and to work with us in the days leading up to Dance Africa. But then we actually had the opportunity to go. I went twice in 2023, once with the students and then once by myself. And this is what the stage looked like. You can see the Adinkra, the Ghanaian Adinkra symbols, and the drums that are on the stage. And then when we had the actual performance, this was an image. You see the American flag and the Ghanaian flag. They've lifted up those Adinkra symbol banners, and this was a collection of all of the performers. And if you look right here, that's Baba Abdel Salam, who is also the founder of Forces of Nature Dance Theater here in New York. Beyond this project-based learning, we were also able to go to, as I mentioned earlier, apologies for the toolbar, the Met's Afrofuturist Period Room, which is the first period room at the Metropolitan Museum of Art dedicated to the lives of African Americans. So thinking about it as this futuristic movement, imagining what the lives of African Americans in this very specific place that where the Metropolitan Museum exists, it was once called Seneca Village, but it was razed, it was destroyed so that Central Park could be established. So Hannah Beekler and the other curators for this started to think what this could look like. And my students and I, we really adored going to see the artworks in this exhibit. We went multiple times. So when you enter this gorgeous space, um, there's this hearth in the back that's imagined to be like a time machine that's taking you from the period of Seneca Village into the future. So there are all of these futuristic diasporic artworks. Uh, so we think about works by Haitian American artists, South African artists, African American artists all coming together and thinking about how that reflected the experience. So students thought through our community artworks unit for our project-based learning, how could artworks be used to reflect the everyday lives of people living in communities? So this was one way that we thought about that. But then, pardon me, we also got into our Islamic art and we took a trip. We took monthly trips to the Metropolitan Museum of Art because they were free for us as public school students, staff, and faculty members. But this is some of the artwork that we were able to see, thinking about how it connected to the work that we were doing. And this was a very special moment. I was saying this to Sarah before we started when we were in the green room, that when we encountered this space within the Islamic art gallery, that this was the Quran and it was set up in this way. And one of my students who was Muslim felt this sense of honor in seeing the Quran set out and that it was such a central part of this particular part of the exhibit. So the next part that we saw, I had to remove a picture because there were some students, but I can speak briefly about the Hear Me Now exhibit at the Met. Hear Me Now was it was really an extraordinary experience because it, as even as an adult, oftentimes one of the sets of expectations I give to my collegiate students is avoid assumptions, ask questions. And this had me asking many questions. These are pots that were created by David Drake, an enslaved African American man who was known for making these massive pots. And these pictures do not even capture the scale. These are very, very large, large pots that were intended to hold things such as grain. But the thing, and you can't really see it as distinctly here, but there are etchings. Mr. Drake was able to etch couplets into the pots. And this was something that was very controversial for the time. There is also a belief that he was severely reprimanded for that. And that's something we could talk about maybe during the Q&A. But to be in the space of seeing these pots and to think about what was considered quote unquote industrial enslavement, where people were producing these pots at a major um, factory space where they were being moved throughout South Carolina and using the rich clay that's there. And it was something that also became this continuum, thinking about the space going from David Drake's pots into the space of thinking about contemporary potters. So my students, we can't look at those pictures, but there were artworks that were related to today. And we were thinking about, once again, the communities from which these artists or artisans, the potters, ceramicists emerged from, and how this artwork reflected their lives. This was an artwork. As someone with locks, I was fascinated by this work. This is one of the more contemporary works that we saw. It's by an artist called, her name is Adebunmi Badebo. And what we see is she went into spaces of the South where enslaved Africans were involved in rice cropping and sifting the rice and the process of doing that. And if you can see in this vessel here, there are grains of rice inside. But then in this particular vessel that she's created, these are actual locks that were cut from people who they cut their hair and gave it to her for this artwork. Here you can even see a cowrie shell that's on the end. But one of the things that that Badebo said she really intended to do when we think about what's culturally relevant and how artworks can reflect the time is to have some DNA imprint of the people of the space, uh, of African Americans that were embedded into her work. And this people thought this was an unlikely way of thinking of community artworks, but my students were, for lack of a better term, obsessed with the Met Gala. And what we did was right around the time that this was happening in 2023, there was a corresponding Karl Lagerfeld exhibit, and we had the chance to go to the Met to look at it. My students were under the impression that we would have free tickets to go to the gala. I said, no, we will not, but we have free tickets to see Karl Lagerfeld's exhibit. So when we got there, these were some of the pieces, and I did a virtual tour before we went to the museum so students could see it. But this is the some of the exhibit. It was packed when we went because it was very popular, but it helps students to think about the ways in which the clothing, the apparel that we wear, reflects cultural aspects of who we are, and also imagine why Karl Lagerfeld was so important, both in the period that he lived as well as we were visiting the museum to see his artwork or to see his clothing. The same day that we saw Karl Lagerfeld's exhibit, we went to see the work of Lauren Halsey, whose work is heavily influenced by sorry, New York horns, by funk music, thinking about Parliament Funkadelic. And she has imagined the east side of Los Angeles hieroglyph prototype, thinking about how she has constructed this space. And when you see it, she has taken the faces of her mother and her cousin, Dominic and her mother, here and included them in her artworks. But this was a massive structure that was very similar to some of the ancient Egyptian artworks that my class looked at as we thought about community artworks in the lower portion of the museum. And this we see all of the things that are etched onto the outside here. Kin folks, be ye who ye is, because if you ain't who you ain't who you think you is. So thinking about identity and this strong space of using Afrofuturist and ancient Egyptian iconography in her work. So where are we? I think even though I would like to say I would go on, I just want to pose this last prompt to you all. What stands out to you about the different arts-based projects described within this category of high expectations and rigorous instruction? And having said that, what I'll do is pause because for the remaining sections, I think that we can all actively think about those aspects of professional learning, which we do, but I want to leave enough time to have an adequate conversation with you all. Uh, and oh my goodness, there are 19 things in the chat. So we have plenty of time, and I would love to see where we go next.
Dr. Kai Lewis, I can, read out and see what people say in the chat, but I am really
Sure.
curious just knowing. So just a reminder to everyone, you will get a handout that has essentially all of the material, all of the content from these slides. But I'm so curious about the assessment because I know that was kind of the next place you were
Oh,
going.
shucks. Yes,
There's a way you could just run us kind of briefly through that slide. I just feel like that's such a great in cap to everything that you've given us so far.
will
And
do.
I know assessments are challenging, as teachers. So
Immensely. Immensely. Thank you for that. So I will go back so we can focus on that, ensuring that I'm sharing the proper slide. Yes, okay. So we will touch upon that. Thank you for the redirection. Here we go. So thinking about inclusive curriculum and assessment, these were some of the Faith Ringgold mosaics that we saw in the subway as we would go up to Harlem to the Apollo. So thinking about these inclusive curriculum and assessment uh, modes, these were some of the ones that were presented in the CRSE framework. So a few of the strategies used to identify inclusive curriculum and assessment are establishing linkages between content and students' lives. So I think that the thing that's unique in this space is thinking about the ways in which the actual curricular content relates to students in some ways. I like to say to students frequently, even at the collegiate level, that they know what they believe and they can be the experts of their lives and the things that they're experiencing. So I think when you're able to pair that with the content, with texts and with multimedia examples, and as we've seen, a series of artworks, that is hugely important. Another strategy for assessment that's provided in the framework is scheduling trips to celebrated cultural sites within the community. So we've seen a few of those sites that are in the greater New York City community, including the Brooklyn Academy of Music, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Apollo, and thinking about for the areas in which, the countries in which, the states in which you live, what are some comparable spaces that you can bring in? Another strategy was incorporating social emotional learning. I feel like we could have done a whole separate slideshow on that because there was an active push for social emotional learning. We had assessments that were specifically designed to measure students' social emotional wellness. And that was not something that was done without having trained professionals with our school guidance counselor and social workers spearheading or leading that. That was something that was actively done, but also bringing in social justice circles, thinking about the ways in which that we could troubleshoot and explore things. Assessment in the classrooms in which I worked was not just academic assessment, but also heavily emotional assessment. And there were also moments where the guidance counselor and the school social worker would actively be in the classroom, not for counseling sessions, but to lead instruction and to assess the room and to assess each of us in that space. And then the last strategy for assessment and inclusive curriculum and assessment is developing cooperative learning projects. And that can be cooperative learning projects with colleagues, thinking about inquiry groups and action research projects that are not done in isolation, but in collectives. But it can also be cooperative learning with some of the organizations, such as the ones that were shared. I know that we were very fortunate to have teaching artists who frequently would come back to our classroom as part of programs such as the Mets PLC. We only had one visit from a teaching artist from the Brooklyn Academy of Music for Dance Africa, but she mentioned that she could come back, although Dance Africa is an annual event here in Brooklyn and in New York. And then lastly, we had residencies that were both virtual and in person through the Apollo. And there was constant assessment with that as well. So I just wanted to touch upon that so that we could get to some things. And it might not be assessment in the way that you would think, like these are the tests so that you must give, but thinking about holistic forms of assessment.
For sure. I live in Seattle. I taught in mostly in Seattle. And it's great when you're in an urban area that has so much that's available and that's
Yes.
free and all of
Mhm.
that. But I also taught in Freddie Harbor, Washington, which is an island.
Oh,
And
wow. Okay.
for a couple of years. And so very small town, very isolated,
Yes.
had to take a ferry to the
Sure.
mainland of Washington. And
Sure.
I'm curious just if you have any, I know you've said like you have to, think about your own area and your own community and
Yes.
what's there, but I'm kind of curious if you
Yes.
just have any other advice to people who are maybe in more remote places, more rural places
Sure.
that don't have
Sure.
the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
But you always, the thing that I learned, and I am a huge advocate, it's one of my, and I tell everyone it's one of my favorite places in the whole world. You could go in there and you just get lost in the galleries. The Met has a lot of artwork that's available online. So you can design online tours. They have constant programming that's happening online. And one of the things that I found, they are very receptive with supporting teachers. So it's also emailing education departments for materials. To see if they have materials they could send, but also for what we're doing. Are they available for a webinar? Could they Zoom in with you? Could they support you in your learning? Could they create a virtual residency? Because that happens so frequently. The other thing, one of my friends, I was talking with her about this online walking program that she has. It's like a virtual walking where she is in one place in the world, but she has a program where she gets these landscapes from Google World, Google Planet, Google Maps. But how that's done. But in thinking about that, I told her one of the things that we did when we were unable to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I really wanted to take my students to the cloisters. We never made it, but they have a Met 360 where you can be at the cloisters. If you have a device like a phone, you can move it around and you're looking at every angle. So you're seeing the steeples, you're seeing the chapels, you're seeing New Jersey across the park and across the water. And I think that even when you're isolated, you can use the internet. Hopefully that'll be a constant, that you have ways to have entry points until you're able to reach that location. If you're able to go, great, but if not, I don't feel like you should be hampered by that because there's so much that's available. And even being in New York, we tapped into that frequently because of lack of funds, lack of time, test prep, like all of these things made it a little tricky, but it was not an impossibility.
It's an amazing time that we live in that we can bring all of that into the classroom. I mean, that's part
Yes.
of what we're so proud of here at Music Workshop with our culture series is that we can bring that into the classroom from all over the
Yes.
world. A lot of it just really takes tapping into your own creativity and then tapping into
Yes.
your network, you know.
Yes.
We have a few minutes left here. I have dropped in the chat our survey link. I'm happy to drop everything again if it gets pushed up too far and you can't find it. But we've got the survey link that's in the chat, and that is to make sure that you get your certificate of completion for this webinar. And I've also dropped a PDF that's from Dr. Kai Lewis, which is, again, it's all of the text content from her presentation. So, ooh, and we do have a question in the Q&A, and this is from Colin in Canada, who we know very well. A few people upvoted it too. I think this is the first time we've had that happen, which is exciting. Colin says, Ramadan starts Friday. I love teaching about different cultures. I don't celebrate Ramadan, but many of my students do. I want to add music and learn. I just worry in public school where the line is between culture and religion, a tricky border. I feel at times lost. Kathleen weighs in and says, I'm in the same boat.
Yes.
And Janet says as well, especially even talking about Christmas music, like where is that balance between religion and
Sure.
culture and school?
One of the things that used to happen at my school, I was not on the school leadership team, but would be in communication with members of the school leadership team. It would be that we would celebrate multiple religious holidays. So recognizing, okay, if we're going to celebrate Christmas, then we're also going to celebrate Kwanzaa. We're also going to celebrate Hanukkah. We're also going to celebrate, um, what am I forgetting? No, that's all of them because we didn't do Three Kings Day. We never got to that. But thinking about how you can celebrate multiple holidays so it's not one over the other. Another thing that we did in terms of thinking about religious holidays, when Ramadan would come, a lot of the students who were fasting, they would have separate rooms that were set up so that they could pray at certain times of the day. And that was something that was made available. In terms of teaching, I know that that was more along of Colin's question. I would say if there's a way to tap into community members, it's not for us to know everything or to pretend that we're experts of things that we're not. There may be people from the community, and not saying that it has to be a religious leader if you're uncomfortable. Could a student's parent come in to speak, or could they film a presentation on their phone, or could they video something that could be a short blurb? Or correspondingly, is there something that is happening at a local mosque that it could be used somehow in instruction? I think that there's so many entry points, but I don't want to just spew out suggestions because, like I was saying, Colin, I think that it is very much driven by your school community, your classroom community, and sort of the culture of your building. So I think that it would be wonderful to celebrate Ramadan. And I know that we had a fabulous times thinking about migration from Syria, thinking about Islam and Islamic art. Students benefited a lot in the sense that they did not necessarily think about some of the nuances until we got into reading a text, other words for home, pairing other words from other words for home with what we were experiencing at the Metropolitan Museum. And then we had a student who felt very comfortable sharing about his experiences going to the mosque, being from Yemen, although Yemen is definitely not Syria. I didn't want to isolate him to say, you have to be the student who shares. He felt confident and proud to share. So I think that was a space where it worked and we could tap into, when we go back to assessment students' experiences, we tapped into the experiences, but simultaneously, students had a different perspective about that student who had never really spoken much about his religion. So it was helpful in our classroom community.
This has been so fantastic. Dr. Abimbola Cole Kai Lewis, everybody. I just wanted to throw up this final slide here. Our K2 hip hop course should be going online tomorrow. This was the course that Dr. Kai Lewis helped us with. We have our grades 3 through 8 version of it out. It's been out since fall, but we've taken it, pared it down a little, added some more interactive things into it. And so it's going to be good for those K through 2 students. And that should be up on the website tomorrow. Also, by next week, we're hoping to have our Music of South Asia course launched. And then we are going to be working very soon, beginning working on our Music and Life course, which is music in the brain, music and emotions, music in our bodies. We also have our Cody's Classroom that's coming up. This is Dr. Cody Raven Morris, who is filming little bite-sized, classroom tips and tricks with us. And then this spring, we will have another Sound Waves concert series as well. Just want to thank everybody for being here, and most certainly thank you, Dr. Abimbola Kolkai Lewis. We just love working with you. I love listening to you. I learned so much today. I hope everybody has something new to take away, something to inspire them. We've got lots and lots of thank yous in the chat if you want to check that out, Dr. Kai Lewis.
I'm so appreciative. Thank you all for this feedback. Thank you.